Welcome into our new video lecture series here with the one and only, the 14th World Chess Champion, Viswanathan Anand. Vishy, we are so excited to have you take us through your games and some of the biggest moments in your career here.
Yeah, I'm very excited to be presenting some of my fondest memories, let's say, and most memorable games. And I hope the audience will get a glimpse of not only what it was like to play these games, but what it felt before, after,
Yeah.
and during.
Yeah, I can't wait. I'm the luckiest chess kid in the world. Obviously, someone who grew up idolizing and watching your games. My first actual chess tournament I followed that mattered, by the way, was the 1995 World Championship match between Viswanathan Anand and Garry Kasparov. Do you remember that match? Were you there for that?
Yeah,
Um,
I made it. I made it somehow for
yeah,
that
you
one,
made it.
and there is this nice picture of Kasparov and me staged on the 108th floor. So we played on the 107th floor, but for that photo, we went up one notch, and there's the New York skyline,
Yeah.
literally everywhere around us. And turned out Hikaru was there for one of those days as well. So
Oh, I didn't know that, but it makes
as a
sense.
7-year-old, as a 7-year-old.
Yeah, it makes
So
sense because he's
uh,
he's only a couple years younger than me. I learned to play chess in the summer of 1995, and
okay.
inspired a little bit earlier that by the movie Searching for Bobby Fischer. And so it really was. I was like, oh, I'm into chess, and oh, there's a world championship match going on in New York, and so I would turn 10 later that year, and so yeah, it makes sense. Hikaru was already playing chess before me, and would come visit. Vishy, we're going to do so much in this series. The series is titled How You Became the Five-Time World Chess Champion. We're going to be going through a number of games just to set the tone here for you viewers. I think probably about 10 videos in total within the series, but we'll let that shape out. And we picked this game to start because we thought it was actually maybe your first game against a former world chess champion, but it wasn't. You were 19 in this game, the Black Pieces versus Mikhail Tal, in a tournament, youth versus experience, right? Tell everybody a little bit about what this tournament was and whether this was your first game against a former world champion or not.
Okay, so this was in 1989 in February, and I had just played in the tournament in Vaikensee. At that time, it was called the Hohovens tournament. Uh, Now it's Tata Steel.
Yeah.
And I got this lovely invitation from Bessel Koch to play this tournament in Cannes. And as everything that Bessel Koch did, he put us up in a fantastic hotel. And as a junior, that's quite something. As a junior, you don't expect to stay in the Martinez right on the beachfront in Cannes, right next to the, where the film festival happens and all that. Um, Here I
A
am
little
with
better
all
than
these
sharing a
legends.
hotel room with Ben Feingold, right? That's a little better than sharing a room with Ben Feingold, right?
Absolutely. No, even that was very
Absolutely.
nice also. And there Tal was my co-commentator. Michael Tal was my co-commentator. Or
Okay.
I should say I was supposed to help him entertain the audience. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
But this was about 8 months after that. I had this very, very nice invitation. And it was a good sign that the youngsters were quite dangerous. So I remember Ulf Anderson won the tournament, half a point ahead of me. But after that, some of his elders were struggling a bit. Bent Larsen struggled a bit, Spassky, Tal as well. And it was only Miles and Ulf Anderson, who are roughly from the 50s, um, who managed a bit easier.
Okay.
And so it was a very nice event. I I checked once you mentioned this fact to me, and the previous day I had beaten Boris Spassky
Ah.
in the third round, and this was the fourth round. Having said that, I did not remember that myself till I had to go and look it up. But uh,
Yeah.
theoretically, Spassky was my first world chess champion that I played in a classical game. I had played Karpov in a blitz, but Spassky was the first champion I played in classical chess, and this was the next day.
Okay. Well, obviously, getting a win against a world champion in the previous day is also pretty good, but I think there's a reason we picked this game. For any of you who haven't seen it, starting off this series with Vishy's win with the black pieces against Mikhail Tal is going to be a great experience for you. You're in for a treat, and so I'm going to dive in. There's so much we're going to get into in this series. That's what makes this so much fun. Going over the great games, learning the chess moments, but having the discussion. But you faced in English, and where were you at this stage in terms of your opening repertoire? Were you, I mean, playing in the international stage against a guy like Mikhail Tal? Were you already, you would go on to be one of those guys who was known for winning games at home, and we'll get into that later on in this series. Some of your most notable victories coming just from incredible preparation. But where were you at this stage, facing the black pieces and facing in English?
My opening preparation at this stage in my career, I'd become a grandmaster just a year earlier, and my opening preparation at this stage was quite similar to someone on the US or English open circuit. It was
Okay.
improvised. It was meant to win with both colors. No solid openings and all that yet, though they had started to creep in, and they
Okay.
were definitely not deeply researched. Literally, my opening preparation consisted of going through games in Chess Informant, and whichever bits I found interesting, I remembered, and I would play them. I would check them very briefly. If nothing obvious turned up, that was my repertoire. And so
That
one day
probably
I could
makes
play c5 against the English, the next day I could play e5, a third day I could play b6.
right.
It's hard to convey just how limited opening preparation was in the pre-computer era compared to
Yeah.
today.
Yeah. That's
Clearly, it grew slowly, but by the year 2000 or so, it was very hard to compare opening preparation from a previous generation with modern stuff. The analysis held up for a long time. I think in the last 10 years you can rewrite most opening theory that was comes from these notebooks and so on, but initially at least a lot of our conclusions held up for quite some time.
I was going to say you're kind of answering the question I had prepared then, not just what you were doing in your approach to the first stage of things, like you said, playing for win with both sides. It would make sense as to why you chose this aggressive knight d4 line. I guess you were improvising and playing sharp lines as best you could. I'm going to go through it and get to this first main position where you played the move rook to b8, and you're already playing an aggressive idea here, trying to attack on the queen side, expose the pressure on the long diagonal. But we're just in a position like this. Were you already on your own improvising, or was this still any kind of prep?
I mean, it was prep where I knew that rook b8 existed. And the point of rook b8 is simply to allow me to play bishop d7, c6. There's an additional threat of b5. And if
Yep.
cb5, then I go
Right.
bishop b7. Yeah,
I'll
bishop
make some
g2, for
random moves
instance.
just
Yeah,
to show something. If b5 comes, the knight is pinned
cb5,
to the
bishop.
bishop, and if
Yeah,
cb5, bishop b7.
bishop b7. And then white has to play e4. And you could make a case that there is some compensation there.
Right.
But the second idea is also just to develop the bishop to c6, which is what happened in the game.
Okay.
And literally, as was the state of my opening preparation in those days, um, I saw rook b8 in a book. I thought, okay, I can play that, and I went to the board. It's
I love that.
it's incredibly naive. It's incredibly naive looking back, but that's how it was in
Yeah.
those days. And actually, sometimes I miss that.
Well, I mean, I don't know, incredibly naive. I think it was probably, for the times, especially when you weren't nearly as afraid as a top player that doing something like that would not just be punished, but be punished in a way where you would never have a chance again, right? And obviously, I've never played chess at your level, but I imagine nowadays part of the reason you would say it's naive to think that is because if you were to do that at any level now, even lower than the world's elite, there's a very good chance that improvising meets something that is just someone worked it out at home and you're dead, right? Is that fair to say?
Partially, that's true to say. It's also true that chess has become more concrete. You could just play moves that seem natural and so on. Of course, you had to do some calculation, but your calculation didn't extend that far. We used a lot of intuition. Now
Yeah,
there are so many more ideas. You have ingredients to work with, and at least I find that you have to navigate them. You can still play improvisational chess, and you can still do things at the board at a minute's notice. But it helps if you know what you have to avoid.
right.
So yeah,
That
that's
makes
where it
sense.
comes from. Anyway, my I played knight h6 because that's what I had seen once, and it seemed relevant to bring the knight to f5. Um, but later on, I thought about this and I felt that even after getting to f5, it's not clear what my knight is doing there.
Right.
And there's one particular line in the game which will highlight this. So a couple of years later, when I played Karpov, I think literally 2 years from this date, I played Karpov in Linares. And then I deviated to knight f6, which I found to be stronger.
Okay.
Or my knight
Oh,
seemed more natural then.
okay. Well, that's interesting, and we'll get into that line like you said after queen to d1, castles, and then you go for the idea you highlighted, not the same while the queen is on f3 to bring the bishop to this diagonal, but still the right plan here for black, right? Bishop d7.
Also, there is a b5 option
Okay.
after bishop d7. Sorry, after
Ah,
bishop d7,
okay. So
where
bishop
I'm threatening
d7,
b5.
threatening
And if
b5. So
c
white
b5, I
plays
can take with the
a4.
bishop because of the pin. Yeah.
White plays a4 to slow that down. You play bishop to c6, and now things start to get get more wild with d4. I'm going to kind of go through the
Yes.
line here and maybe stop me when you feel like we're reaching something instructional or something worthy of note. But takes and rook c8 is interesting in that you've kind of had to abandon this whole b5 idea. But how are you feeling about your chances at this point?
Um, Looking at it today, it seems to me that suddenly the knight on h6 is kind of misplaced. f5
Hmm.
is not the ideal square. I'd prefer it on f6. In fact, I'm not even sure the
Right,
queen d3 was the right way to go. I think if he had played d5, we'll see this. If he had played d5, then my knight is looking awkward. If I even after it goes to f5, where is it supposed to go on further? White can
right.
make moves like rook a2 and move his knight in exchange and kind of improve. But what is black supposed to do? If I play e6 at some point,
Yeah.
then these pawns could be a bit soft. But otherwise, the knight has no natural way back. So I think nowadays I'd probably take on d4 instead of rook c8 because I would not be sure what I'm supposed to do after d5, after
And
rook
is the
c8
idea that
d5.
once you've taken on d4, the knight on f5 has a little more purpose because the pawn on e3 is gone, so the bishop and knight are working together? Is this the idea?
Very much so. And also,
Okay.
the now it's harder to kick my knight. e4 was a natural
Right.
way to kick my knight. g4 is going to be risky.
Right. And if white
So
plays
there's no
d5
easy way to
similarly,
displace it. Yeah.
if white would have played
And
d5
we will
similarly, what would
continue.
you have
I
done?
suspect here I'm just doing okay because I can do something very similar to the game, which is to play e5. And if white takes that, I take back. And because the white's b3 pawn is quite weak, there's a kind of
Right.
balance in the position. If
That makes sense.
black is not doing very well, I mean, if my queen gets to c6, his king could get uncomfortable and so on.
Right. Okay.
Very similar to
Okay.
the game, which we will see.
Okay, it makes sense. So
So
that moment he didn't play d5 when he maybe had the opportunity and you didn't give him a second chance. He traded and brought the knight in. And after d5,
the point was also that now my next move, I get to play queen b6, and that,
yeah, which is what happened. Yeah.
yes, which is what happened. I played queen b6, and now I'm attacking b3, so his pieces are getting, what's the word, discombobulated.
Yeah, it's a simple move order change, but actually fascinating because now white actually is, you can't really move the knight without allowing the exchange, and there's no other clear way to defend the pawn besides bringing the queen back. But he didn't like that. Well, then the knight could come to d4. So white
D4.
had to
So
play
he
knight
no,
d4.
he would have to go queen D1,
Yeah, to avoid that. Okay.
but then he's going to get into trouble because I have rook takes C4 maybe.
Oh wow, nice.
Well, hang on, I'm not sure about this. Rook takes C4
It feels so
looks
good
good,
though.
but if he plays, yeah, then this is over because
Yeah,
I'm threatening the knight and I'm also threatening knight E3 check.
love that. Okay.
But the problem is if he plays A5, what happens?
Mm, right, you'd have to go queen b4,
So
rook
this
a4.
might simply not work. So I would have to go queen B4.
Is it rook a4?
He would go rook A4,
Yeah.
and that does not look happy.
Okay.
So
Okay.
it's not rook C4, but I mean, who's going to go back to D1 like this? So
Right. Okay. Makes sense. Okay. So so clearly unhappy now with the position, forced to play knight d1. Exchanging the bishops definitely advantage black, right? Getting those dark square pieces off the board. Am I right about that? Just looking at the position here, you felt good about that.
I felt good about that, but there is a problem, which is that at the moment B3 is weak, but it's not so weak that it's going to bother white.
Right.
And in fact, there are quite a lot of Marotzis where white gets this clamp
Mm-hmm.
on the queen side with the pawn on d5 and then this
Yeah. Yeah.
suffocating the b5 break. And if white regroups his knight, he's actually doing much better than black. So it's my next move which is key.
Okay, it's really interesting because
And
when you first said clamp, my brain went to, yeah, the structure on the E file, because that's a typical exchange in the Maroczy bind, the Marco hop. But I wasn't even thinking about how much this space advantage could become very problematic. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Man, it's such a selfish chess lesson for me. I'm learning so much. And I see now what you're saying about E5 being really key to force the nature of the position to change, because if white does it en passant, you've now permanently created a home for the knight, which will be problematic, right?
exactly. And also now suddenly the e pawn, instead of being backward on e7, is
Right.
forward. And that makes a difference. I mean, for instance, I could play e4 as a sacrifice here because if queen takes e4, I would take on b3. And so ideas have turned up. And this pawn is no longer a weakness on e7. So that's the main lesson here.
Okay. Awesome
And it's
stuff.
only this move that starts to give me the advantage because he had to take. And now I'm doing well because that knight on b2 suddenly is in no position to compete on the knight on f5. I mean, if that same knight was on c2 or e2, white would be doing very well. But
Hmm.
exactly on this square, it seems to be lost. And I've got queen c6 check pointing at the king. Perhaps I could put a knight on d4 and a pawn on e5. Again, that knight can never challenge the knight on d4. So there are nice plans emerging for black.
This is so, I mean, what is the sense, what is the sense that a chess player has to develop of timing, right? Because again, like my brain went immediately to what you said about the Marco hop structure, the E file being a problem. And I have played a lot of these structures as black in my career and lost a lot of them. Grandmasters like Wojciech, I feel like, made a habit of beating me in the American Swiss circuit, as you said, on the white side of these Maroczy binds, or, you know, it came from his sort of Catalan structure. But the sense of knowing the timing that needs to change, because normally this type of advance doesn't work in this structure because of what you highlighted, which is that the en passant creates a vulnerability where you're often creating new forms of problems, right? But in this particular sense, was it like recognizing that white's pieces are just not ideally coordinated, opening the position is well timed because the opponent's piece is inactive, or is there something else that you just kind of like sense that this was going to work in a position where often it's too risky?
It's probably not something you mentally think about in this way, but yes, I could see that white has gotten these pawns on e6 and d6 can be soft or they can be fine. It depends
Right,
on where the piece is, and that knight on b2 is really not participating in any way. As a knight on c3 would be able to restrain d5, it could come to b5, it could go to e4, and so
right,
on. Even a
right,
knight on e2 could sit on f4 forever and hold them back. And then that allows the rooks to come and double on the d file or the e file or whatever.
right.
Exactly on b2, it's in a thing. And I don't give him the time to regroup. So he's
Yeah,
not in time to get back to a decent square quickly.
I love it. I just love the intuitive kind of awareness of the. It's like normally this doesn't work, but the pieces are not coordinated properly, and so black strikes perfectly. And now you immediately start. It almost looks like all your pieces were planned the whole time. Now you start this operation on the F file. You have this idea, and it's like all the black's pieces have been conspiring this whole time for some sort of attack. Um, I
Yes.
love this move.
And so now I can play e5 because that rook is defending d6 as well. So
Yep,
once I put my knight on d4, I can double on the f file, and some plans are emerging here quite nicely.
I love it. I'm just so you know, I feel like I'm living through you. I feel like we're winning this game together. It's so nice for me. Queen King to G7. I know you're like, thanks, Danny. I'm glad I could do that for you. Queen to B5, Queen C7. But again, yeah, at this point, just makes sense to keep the queens on the board for obvious reasons, not just the potential of the attack, but trading is like the one way White might be okay in the endgame. This move
But actually, if
C5,
you
okay.
just go back a few moves, if you go back three
Yeah.
moves with the queen
Okay.
on d3,
Okay.
um, so here we have this problem is that I think White understood how bad his position is getting. And at least at a practical level, if you imagine you're sitting with the white pieces, you see knight d4 coming, then b3 is vulnerable. You also see that knight d4 preps queen c6 check. It also prepares one black piece to sit on the f3 square.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and his next two moves reek of a bit of desperation to me.
Right.
I don't know the computer evaluation offhand, whether it's much better for black, only slightly better, but here we see the difference between a human and a computer. A human panics as well, and there is something about Michael Tal's next two moves which tell me he's uncomfortable. He's trying to change the course of the game in a hurry, and sometimes he's getting into more trouble as he goes along. Um, so Queen B5, King G7, Queen D5, King G7, Queen B5. I simply sidestep the exchange, and now I'm threatening Knight D4. So he's forced to then justify a bad move with one more bad move, which is C5.
Mm-hmm.
I take on C5. He takes on B7. I go Rook C7, and all he has accomplished is um, swapped a good pawn for a bad pawn. Now I have the B3 pawn is weak,
Right.
and I think my advantage has grown. But you have this feeling that sometimes when you have a bad position, you start to make things worse. I think this is a good example of that.
It's all too often as chess players. So Queen to D5, Queen B4.
So
He
just
doubles.
keeping a step ahead of him so that he can't exchange anything,
Okay.
especially queens. Though I suspect I might be better anyway, even after queen exchange. But
Yeah, and is that mainly because even if the queens were exchanged, White has the 2-on-1, but these center pawns are no longer backward like you would think in a Marashi structure, right? So the endgame is probably better for you anyway, but still makes sense to keep the queens on the board. Is that
yes, because if his knight comes to c4 after the exchange, he might just be able to bail out into some kind of rook ending. I mean, it feels
right?
wrong to allow that in the first place. So
Okay, makes sense.
queen b4 is correct.
Okay,
And queen b4 restrains his knight c4 because I just take on b3.
that's really nice actually. So the queen needs to defend B3, so knight C4 would not be possible. Instead, he played queen to A8 here. You win B3.
Yes, and I decided to take this pawn. Um, he now did queen
He played
takes
knight D3.
a7
If he
check.
takes
No, he did knight
A7,
d3
yeah.
first. Yeah.
If he takes A7, you're playing rook F7.
Yes.
Okay. So he plays knight D3.
Yes. I went rook
And
c2.
he
I
goes
could
back
have gone
to,
back to c7, and he's looking quite helpless actually. But
in this position on queen E4, you could have gone back to C7, you're saying.
no, on the previous move, so that he doesn't have any queen takes a7 check even. But
Okay.
it's
Well,
not a
I was
big
just
deal either
wondering
way,
about
I
that.
think.
So why,
Yeah.
obviously, you would calculate it, but what's the concrete idea of giving up this
I think
pawn? And
just rook f7, and the question is where is that queen supposed to go? It should go to. If
so
it
if it,
goes here, I think queen d5 could win. Yes.
okay, so you go here.
So if it goes there, I think queen d5 wins. So he has to go back to a8, and let's try knight e3 check here.
Oh, wow.
And after f takes e3, I go queen takes d3 because of the pin. and yeah, he's busted. So he can't do that.
Love that. Okay, so that's the concrete threat, and of course, as we said, it makes sense that queen here would allow queen d5 and probably even just knight d4 next, right? Okay, so that's good enough. Wow. Okay, so instead he abandons the a7 pawn, bringing the queen back to attempt to defend.
And now I shuffle around. The only thing I have to, the only mistake I have to avoid is not allowing him to. In fact, here crowded position helps me because the more pieces there are, it seems that it's hard, much harder for white to coordinate. And by the way, my knight is still way superior to his knight. His knight is totally hemmed in by this d6 e5 wall.
Yeah.
And on the queen side, it's got no supporting pawns, so it's got no squares accessible to it. Whereas
Yep.
I've got a lot of things to play with, and I can choose if I can play e4 and so on. The position is winning already. I won't labor the point, but it's
Okay. That makes sense.
rook
And also
d4.
keeping the pieces on the board, increasing the chances that he blunders more than
Yeah.
likely too, because getting harder and harder to keep all your
Now he
pieces
can't
safe.
go queen g8 because a queen c6 check.
Okay, very nice. Very, oop, not that. That's what we call a mouse slip. Mouse slips don't happen in over the board chess. Um,
That is true.
although in blitz, sometimes you can move a piece and slide it accidentally. You have to be careful, right? That's the equivalent of a mouse slip, maybe. Um,
That's true.
sorry, random. Okay, king. So instead,
So
he
queen
plays queen to
d5.
d5. But now is where you show the power of all black's pieces being coordinated and ready to pounce. Do you want to do the honors and tell everybody what you played?
Yeah, I went knight e3 check.
Boom.
And the point is, if f takes e3, I go queen c2 check. He goes king h3. And the nicest win is rook h4 check.
Oh man, that is just awesome. And the point is, if king takes, queen takes h2, and if pawn takes, rook f3 and queen g2.
King g4 and queen g2 is mate. So
Just awesome stuff. So instead he didn't take the knight. He played king to g1.
he went king g1. I went queen c2.
And
He now went desperately. So the problem for him is I'm threatening queen d1 mate. So he actually has to move the rook somewhere.
right,
So he went to f1.
but
I could take on d3 with the queen. But
okay,
then we will get an ending that I'll still have to win,
right.
though I'm I'm 2 pawns up. But rook d3 is easier.
And you didn't
I
want to
went
take
rook
the rook on
d3, and the
f4.
problem for him is that after he cannot play, yeah, knight f1, queen d7 is just the sort of thing you'd rather not calculate. It
Right,
might be working as far as I know, but it might not, and
right,
it feels like bad technique to go for it,
right.
especially when the alternative is there rook takes d3.
Yeah, take
Because now if
d3.
queen takes d7, then do you want to do this, Danny?
Yeah, I'll do this one. Puzzle rush. Queen takes
Yeah.
f2
So queen
check.
f2 check,
That's
and
actually really
that
nice.
forces everything. So
I didn't have any analysis. I did solve it in real time. So Vishy's always been my coach ever since he started joining for commentary. Lets me have easy tactics sometimes. Um, that's awesome. And so in the game he played rook f1. You took d3, and in fact, um, did he? Wait, no.
he
Did he
resigned.
actually play it out, or he resigned right there?
He resigned right there.
Okay.
Rook takes
Yeah.
d3,
Yeah. Awesome. Well,
and
so
I
go
have
ahead.
to say, in his defense, he had to withdraw from the tournament a day or two later because he was so sick. So he was already in bad shape by this point.
Yeah.
Um,
Still a
so
great.
it's of course nice to beat a legend, but
Yeah.
I have to put that in his defense. I mean, this is not a typical Michael Tal game. Even in 1989, he
Yeah.
still came up with amazing stuff when he was in good shape.
Always classy and humble in victory, Vishy Anand. Shout out, of course, R.I.P. to the late and great Mikhail Tal, the magician from Riga. Now, just to wrap a bow on this, because everything about what we're doing here is sort of telling your journey as a chess player. You had already played on the international stage. Your earliest tournaments, at least on record, were about the age of 14. You were representing India in the Olympiad, right? You had played in the World Youth, the World Under 20. But could you say this tournament here, the Youth versus Experience, beating Spassky and now beating Tal, was this a bit of a coming to the high stage for you at 19, or do you feel like you had arrived yet, or not quite yet?
I think 1988 and 1989 was when I started to feel a natural part of the circuit. I was
Okay.
consistently playing in Europe. I was playing in good tournaments, good opens, and closed events. I was starting to play more and more people, and this for me maybe would be one more step that I was on the right track. Also, like I said, it was a very emotional period for me because I was playing in tournaments with people I'd read about, in tournaments I only read about, and suddenly there I was competing with everyone. And it's that moment when you switch from small opens to playing
Right.
in glamorous events. And
Hmm.
so I remember many of these these tournaments very fondly. Uh, I simply enjoyed going for endless walks on the Crozet in Cannes and
Yeah.
in these
Well, and
nice
beating
towns.
Tal particularly must have been special because we're going to get more into your career and growing up in India, but you were trained in a Soviet chess center in India that was named after Tal, right? So the chess culture shock and maybe winning this game has a little bit of a special memory because it's one of your more famous ones here, right?
I don't think I quite uh, kept thinking of the connection between the Tal Chess Club and Michael Tal, even though it's a very natural connection to make. Um,
In hindsight, that's what we do
in
here. We tell
hindsight,
stories.
I
So
think you can see the way it connects up. But I really enjoyed meeting him the previous year as a commentator because he was so gracious and so nice.
yeah,
And I actually went out of his way to make me feel very comfortable there on stage. And he was already very famous for almost turning down no one. Anybody who walked in and wanted a game of Blitz. I mean, you can do endless jokes. I walked into the bar and played a game of Blitz with Tal, kind of stuff. It works.
right.
He was a very, very nice person, and I respect that a lot. Um,
Amazing.
and he always showed very entertaining tactics. And yes, having come from the Tal Club to kind of interact with him and play with him here was very nice. Every tournament like this gave me more confidence. I mean, this tournament gave me a lot of confidence because
Great.
I had 4 wins and only 1 loss, and I felt, hey, I'm growing into this. So that's nice.
Amazing, amazing thoughts, amazing stuff, Ishi. Can't wait to continue this series. Hope that everyone here is enjoying it. Please leave a comment, give us a share, and tell us how much you are liking it. Otherwise, you can also check out the library collection of all of the games we will be reviewing in this particular video series, How Vishy Anand Became a Five-Time World Chess Champion. With that, we will move on to part 2 and see you there.